Hello there, I'm Alato, and this is the first book review I've done on this channel. That being said, I'm really excited to start doing this. I've had a passion for xenofiction since I was young, so starting a project like this feels like a great way for me to express that. I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Bambi: A Life in the Woods was written by Felix Salten in 1923 and originally published in Berlin. According to Wikipedia, in its most complete translation, it is seen as a parable of the dangers and persecution faced by Jews in Europe. Due to the fact that this might have been lost in the English version, I won't be touching the subject. I simply didn't see enough parallels to warrant talking about it. Most English speakers today will recognize the Disney adaptation of Bambi before the book, but I feel like the book is just as good for anyone who enjoys media from the perspective of animals. Overall, I'd give this book 8 out of 10 stars and would recommend it to anyone over 8 who is willing to dip their feet into xenofiction. If you're unfamiliar with this story, I'll quickly explain, spoiler-free. Bambi: A Life in the Woods follows Bambi, a roe deer, as he grows up in the wild and experiences the world and other animals around him. While the story manages to retain quite a bit of realism, the animals are anthropomorphized more than in stories such as The Fox and the Hound or The Last Eagle. These inclusions are mostly easy to ignore or play along with, adding to the story instead of distracting from it. I have very few gripes with this book, but a few gripes nonetheless. Without going into spoiler territory just yet, I want to say that most characters in the story other than the roe deer remain nameless, simply referred to by their species and sometimes relation to Bambi. I found this very confusing in instances where there are multiple unnamed characters that share the same species. At first, I brushed the lack of names off as intentional. I thought that Mr. Salten might have done this to keep the reader's attention on the deer, but there are times where the story takes more interest in the other species than necessary, so I realized that may not be the case. My next assumption was that it was a cultural thing. Maybe only the deer named their children? But no, about halfway through the story, we're suddenly introduced to 2 pheasants with names. I would excuse this if they were very important characters, but the only 2 named animals who aren't deer so far do absolutely nothing. In fact, they only appear once in the whole story. Something else I'm not a fan of is how the narrator switches from knowing objects that the deer wouldn't to not knowing. Although this can easily go unnoticed if you're not looking for it. Thankfully, the things I like about the book far outweigh the bad. The descriptions of the forest scenery is immersive. The way the animals emote and talk is fun. They all share traits with their real counterparts, and it's believable the way they talk and act. The birds are chatty, the hare sensitive, and the deer flighty. Exploring all of the forest creatures and how they interacted was very exciting to say the least. Character relationships were realistic and fun to explore. I loved the interactions between the deers and how they changed further along the story. It aids the central theme of the story, growing up and learning to live as an adult, immensely. The themes themselves aren't shoved down the reader's face, which I find quite nice. Although, I find that Salten did take a much more subtle approach when conveying Bambi's journey to adulthood than his struggle against man. I have a suspicion that in the original translation, man specifically was meant to represent Jewish persecution, instead of it simply being all dangers that the deer face. In the English version, though, it comes across as a straightforward man versus nature theme. Well, deer versus nature, I suppose. There are a few things that I still haven't mentioned though, albeit because they were heading into spoiler territory, and I didn't want to start the first half of the video with that. If you haven't read the book yet, I recommend that you close the video and go do that instead. I had fun reading it, you'll have fun reading it, but if you're okay with having some of the plot points spoiled, or don't plan to read the book at all, feel free to keep watching. One of the things I appreciated most about the book was Bambi's relationship with both his mother and implied father. They never felt too chummy or hyped up for what their relationship is truly portrayed as. That being an adult ensuring that their offspring survives to have offspring of their own. Bambi misses his mother when she's gone, of course, but he quickly gets over it in a way that I think is realistic for a young deer. When Bambi seeks out his implied father, the comfort he feels from being near the older stag isn't told to the reader, it's shown. It may seem weird that I keep saying implied father, but the reader is only led to believe that the old prince is Bambi's father. It's never explicitly stated until quite near the end of the book, and even then, it's up for interpretation. In fact, it's even implied that Bambi's mother doesn't exactly know who Bambi's father is, as she only points out a whole group of stags and not a single one to label their father. I think that it's a nice touch on realism. There's no reason that the reader has to know who the father is, and so the ambiguity adds context to the rest of the deer's relationships, especially the relationship between Bambi and his implied father. To me, at least, it feels more impactful that Bambi's father didn't know he was his father. It's just that he felt drawn to the young deer, and so he took him under his wing. I feel like it's more impactful than if Salten simply said that he was Bambi's father, and then we were led to believe that the only reason the old prince cared about Bambi was because he was part of his bloodline. There is one specific instance where I wish the author kept familial relationships this ambiguous. You see, in the book, while Bambi and his mother are visiting the meadow, they bump into some other deer. Bambi's mom calls the other doe her sister, and the two fawns with her are referred to as Bambi's cousins. One of the fawns, named Feline, later grows up and has a romantic relationship with Bambi as adults. She then has fawns of her own, which are implied to be Bambi's children, if not outright said. So, did Bambi have an incestuous relationship with his cousin? I certainly hope not, but maybe. There's always the case that Bambi's mother meant sister in a friendly way, not familial. You know, the way you might call a close friend your sister, or nuns do. But if so, it's never stated, and never happens again. Also, that wouldn't explain why Bambi calls Feline and Gobo his cousins, as at first he shared no special bonds with them. Sadly, it seems more likely that Bambi had incest babies with his cousins, as much as it pains me to say that. This was probably the worst part of the book, and could have easily been avoided by simply calling Bambi's and Feline's moms friends. I can't really wrap my head around why it was included. Maybe it was a translation error? It's a shame that I can't read German, or else I would definitely give the original a look at. Well, that's the end of my thoughts on the book. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. It's how I keep motivated to make these things. Also, feel free to leave a comment with any suggestions on how to better my videos, or what xenofiction books I should review. I already have quite the list lined up, but I'm always on the lookout for anything that might cue my interest. If you enjoyed my little avatar, consider following me on Tumblr or Instagram, where I post a lot of finished commissions and fan art. The information for that will be in the description.